I was sitting in my living room watching the Weather Channel report a severe thunderstorm warning for our area of suburban Indianapolis when my doorbell rang 3 times in rapid succession. The kind of aggressive ringing that meant trouble was already at my doorstep. Opening the door revealed exactly what I expected. Patricia Morrison, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, standing under a bright pink umbrella despite the rain not yet falling, her lips pressed into that familiar thin line of disapproval. Behind her loomed her husband Derek, a tall man who always looked like he wished he was anywhere else, and her best friend Carolyn, who served as the HOA secretary and shared Patricia's talent for finding problems where none existed. "Mr. Carmichael," Patricia said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "we need to discuss your flagrant violation of the community standards immediately." I leaned against the doorframe, already exhausted by whatever fresh drama she had manufactured. "Patricia, there's a severe storm coming." "Can this wait?" "Absolutely not. Your vehicle is parked in your driveway at an angle that exceeds the permitted degree of deviation from parallel alignment with your garage door. According to Section 12, Subsection 4, Paragraph B of our covenant, vehicles must be parked in a manner that presents a uniform and aesthetically pleasing appearance to the neighborhood." I glanced past her at my truck, which was maybe 5 degrees off from perfectly straight in my own driveway. "You're joking." "The HOA does not joke about community standards, Mr. Carmichael. This is your 3rd violation this month. We're implementing a fine of $200, due within 14 days. The wind was picking up now, sending leaves skittering across the street. Dark clouds were rolling in fast from the west, and the Weather Channel had just upgraded the warning to include possible hail and damaging winds. "Patricia, I'm not paying a fine because my truck isn't perfectly aligned in my own driveway, and frankly, you should get home before this storm hits." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you refusing to comply with HOA regulations?" "I'm telling you that I parked my truck in my driveway, on my property, and there's nothing in any legitimate covenant that gives you the authority to fine me for it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to secure my patio furniture." I started to close the door, but Patricia stuck her designer boot in the gap. "This isn't over, Mr. Carmichael. The HOA board will be discussing your continued pattern of resistance at our emergency meeting tonight. We have the authority to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines." "There's a severe thunderstorm warning, Patricia. You're not holding a meeting tonight." She pulled out her phone, showing me a group text. "The meeting was called for 7 p.m. at my house. All board members have confirmed." We take our responsibilities seriously, even when residents like you make our jobs unnecessarily difficult. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and threatening. I could see the shelf cloud approaching, that ominous formation that meant serious weather was imminent. "That's incredibly stupid and dangerous, but you do what you want. Just get off my property." Patricia withdrew her foot, her expression triumphant like she had won something. "You'll be hearing from our attorney." The HOA doesn't tolerate residents who think they're above the rules everyone else follows. They hurried back to Patricia's white BMW X5 parked across the street, and I watched them drive away before closing my door. Through the window, I could see my neighbor Tom shaking his head from his porch. He caught my eye and gave me a sympathetic wave. Tom had been battling Patricia for 6 months over the color of his mailbox, which she claimed was colonial blue instead of the approved heritage navy. They looked identical to everyone else. The storm hit around 6:30, and it hit hard. The wind came first, bending trees at angles that made me nervous about the old oak in my backyard. Then came the rain, not falling so much as being hurled sideways in sheets that made visibility drop to nearly nothing. I sat away from the windows, watching the lightning flash continuously. The thunder so constant it became almost a single sustained roar. My phone buzzed with multiple emergency alerts. Severe thunderstorm warning, wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour expected, potential for flash flooding. Seek shelter immediately. I texted my girlfriend Rebecca, who lived across town, to make sure she was safe. She responded that she was hunkered down in her bathroom with her cat, waiting it out. The power flickered twice before dying completely, plunging the house into darkness broken only by lightning flashes. I grabbed my emergency flashlight and checked that my phone was charged. According to the radar app, the worst of the storm would pass in about 20 minutes, but it would be a rough 20 minutes. I thought about Patricia and her idiotic HOA meeting, wondering if they had actually gathered at her house or if common sense had prevailed. Knowing Patricia, she probably considered canceling due to weather to be a sign of weakness. The woman had once cited someone for not mowing their lawn during a heat wave when the city had issued a water conservation notice asking residents to let grass go dormant. The wind was howling now, and I heard something crash in my backyard, probably the recycling bin I had forgotten to bring in. Then came the hail, small at first but quickly growing to what sounded like golf balls sized based on the noise it made hammering against my roof and windows. I moved to the interior hallway, the safest place in my house, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. It was during the height of the storm, with the wind screaming and the hail pounding and the lightning creating a strobe effect through the windows, that I heard it. A tremendous crash from somewhere close by, the sound of metal tearing and glass shattering, followed by a car alarm blaring. The alarm cut off after a few seconds, leaving just the storm sounds. I waited until the hail stopped before cautiously moving back toward the windows. The rain was still heavy but manageable. Using my flashlight, I looked out toward the street, trying to see what had crashed. My truck was fine in the driveway. Tom's cars across the street looked okay, but something had definitely crashed nearby. When the worst of the storm passed and the rain lessened to a steady downpour, I grabbed my raincoat and went outside to investigate. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees, and the air smelled like ozone and wet earth. Tree branches and leaves littered the street, and I could see roof shingles scattered across lawns. I walked to the end of my driveway and looked up and down the street, shining my flashlight into the darkness. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards down the street, Patricia's white BMW was wrapped around a utility pole, the entire front end crumpled like an accordion. The driver's side was caved in significantly, and broken glass sparkled in my flashlight beam across the wet pavement. "Oh no," I muttered, breaking into a run despite the rain. Whatever issues I had with Patricia, I didn't want to see anyone hurt. As I got closer, I could see the scene more clearly. The BMW had clearly been traveling too fast for the conditions when it lost control. The skid marks were visible even in the rain, showing how the car had hydroplaned, spun sideways, and then slammed into the pole. The pole itself was tilted at a dangerous angle, with power lines hanging low across the street. I approached the car carefully, mindful of the downed lines, and shined my light inside. Patricia was slumped in the driver's seat, her airbag deployed, blood running down her face from a cut on her forehead. Her eyes were closed. My heart hammered as I reached for the door handle, but stopped when I heard someone else approaching. Tom appeared with his own flashlight, already on his phone. "I'm calling 911. Don't touch anything near those power lines." "She's unconscious," I said, trying to see if Patricia was breathing. In the flashlight beam, I could see her chest rising and falling. She's alive, but we need to get her out. The power lines are down. If they still live and you touch that car, you're dead. Wait for the fire department. Tom was speaking rapidly into his phone, giving the emergency dispatcher the address and details. Other neighbors were emerging now, despite the continuing rain. Mr. Rodriguez from 2 houses down came running with a first aid kit. Mrs. Chen stood at a safe distance, holding an umbrella and looking worried. Everyone knew Patricia, whether they wanted to or not. What the hell was she doing out in this? Mr. Rodriguez asked, eyeing the down power lines warily. HOA meeting, I said, the words tasting bitter. She told me this afternoon they were having an emergency meeting at her house at 7. She must have been driving home. Tom gave me an incredulous look. During a severe thunderstorm warning. That's insane. Within minutes, we could hear sirens approaching. The fire department arrived first, followed quickly by an ambulance and 2 police cars. The firefighters immediately secured the scene, using equipment to test whether the power lines were still live. They were not, thankfully, as the storm had knocked out power to the entire neighborhood. Once the scene was safe, the paramedics moved in. They carefully extracted Patricia from the wreckage, stabilizing her neck and loading her onto a stretcher. She was starting to regain consciousness, moaning and trying to move. One of the paramedics kept talking to her, telling her to stay still, that she had been in an accident. A police officer approached me, notepad in hand. He was young, probably mid-20s, with rain dripping off his cap. "You the one who found the vehicle?" "I heard the crash from my house," I said, pointing back toward my place. "Came out when the hail stopped to see what happened." "Did you witness the accident itself?" "No, I was inside. It happened during the worst of the storm, but I saw her earlier, around 6. She stopped at my house with her husband and a friend, something about HOA business. She mentioned they were having a meeting at her house tonight." The officer frowned. "During the storm warning." "That's what I said. She insisted it was happening regardless of the weather." He took down my information, along with statements from Tom and the other neighbors who had responded to the scene. Another officer was taking photographs of the crash site, documenting the skid marks, the damage to the vehicle, and the position of everything before the tow truck arrived. Patricia was being loaded into the ambulance now, and I could hear her starting to talk, though I couldn't make out the words. The paramedics shut the doors and the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing but siren off, heading toward St. Vincent Hospital downtown. The officer came back to me. "Just so I'm clear, you had no interaction with Miss Morrison between when she left your property around 6 p.m. and when you discovered the accident?" "None whatsoever. I was inside my house the entire time, riding out the storm. I heard the crash, waited until the hail stopped and came out to investigate." "And her vehicle never came back to your property during that time?" "No, I would have heard it. My house was dark because the power was out. I was sitting in the hallway and I would have noticed headlights or heard an engine over the storm." He nodded, making notes. "Okay, Mr. Carmichael. We may need to follow up with additional questions, but that should be all for tonight. Thanks for your quick response to the scene." The tow truck arrived and began the process of extracting Patricia's BMW from around the utility pole. The damage was extensive. The entire front end was destroyed, both airbags had deployed, and the driver's side was crumpled inward. It was clear the car was totaled. Given the severity of the impact, Patricia was lucky to be alive. I walked back to my house, soaked despite my raincoat, and changed into dry clothes. The power was still out, and would likely remain that way until morning given the extent of the storm damage. I checked my phone. Multiple messages from Rebecca asking if I was okay, a few from friends in the area checking in, and one from my sister in Fort Wayne who had seen news about the severe weather. I was responding to messages by the light of a battery-powered lantern when my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Mr. Carmichael, this is Derek Morrison, Patricia's husband." His voice was strained, stressed. "I'm at St. Vincent Hospital. The police gave me your number as one of the witnesses to the accident." "How is she?" I asked, setting aside whatever feelings I had about Patricia's HOA tyranny. Nobody deserved to be hurt. "She has a concussion, some broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and a lot of bruising. They're keeping her overnight for observation, but she should be okay. She's pretty out of it right now from the pain medication." He paused. "I wanted to thank you for calling 911 so quickly. The doctors said if she had been stuck there much longer in the cold and rain, it could have been worse. I'm glad she's going to be all right. What happened? Did she say why she was out driving in that storm?" Another pause, longer this time. "She said she was coming from the HOA meeting at our house. But here's the thing. The meeting was canceled. I canceled it around 5:30 when I saw the weather forecast. I sent out a group text to all the board members telling them it was postponed until next week. I felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. Patricia told me at 6 that all the board members had confirmed they were still coming. That's impossible. I sent the cancellation notice, and everyone responded acknowledging it. Carolyn, Jim, Sandra, and Michael all confirmed they received the message and agreed the meeting should be postponed. Patricia was home with me until about 6:45. She said she needed to run out quickly to check on something before the storm got worse. I told her it was a terrible idea, but you know Patricia. When she decides something needs to be done, there's no talking her out of it. Did she say what she needed to check on? No, she just grabbed her keys and left. She seemed agitated about something, but I figured it was just stress from the storm approaching." Derek sighed heavily. "The police asked me a strange question. They asked if Patricia had been to your house tonight after 6 p.m. My mind was racing now. Why would they ask that? I don't know. But Patricia is insisting that she crashed because she was swerving to avoid your truck, which she claims was blocking the street. She's telling everyone that you deliberately parked your truck in the road during the storm to cause problems, and that's why she crashed." I felt anger rising in my chest. "That's completely false. My truck has been parked in my driveway the entire evening. I haven't moved it since this morning." "I believe you," Derek said quietly, "but Patricia is very insistent. Even through the pain medication. She keeps saying that you caused the accident and that the HOA is going to hold you responsible for all the damages." "Let me make this absolutely clear," I said, keeping my voice steady. "My truck was in my driveway, on my property, at an angle Patricia apparently objected to based on her visit to my house this evening. It never left my property. I never left my property except to respond to the accident after it happened. There are multiple witnesses who can confirm this, including the police officer who took my statement. I understand. I just wanted to warn you that Patricia is threatening to file a lawsuit. She's already talked to her lawyer from the hospital. I know my wife can be difficult, especially with HOA matters, and I wanted to give you a heads up. I appreciate that, Derek, but if Patricia wants to lie and blame me for her own reckless decision to drive too fast in a severe thunderstorm, she's going to find out that doesn't work in court." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, processing what Derek had told me. Patricia was going to try to blame me for her accident. The woman had come to my house to harass me about parking in my own driveway, then drove recklessly during a dangerous storm, crashed her own vehicle, and was now claiming it was my fault. The audacity was staggering, even for Patricia. The next morning, power was restored around 8 a.m. I made coffee and surveyed the damage in my backyard. Several large branches down, the recycling bin destroyed, some shingles missing from the roof, but overall nothing too serious. The neighborhood looked like it had been through a war, with debris everywhere and several damaged vehicles from hail impacts and fallen branches. I took photos of my truck, still parked in the driveway exactly where it had been the night before. I documented the angle, the position relative to the garage, and the clear fact that it was entirely on my property and not blocking the street in any way. Then I walked down to where Patricia's accident had occurred. In daylight, the scene looked even more dramatic. The utility pole was severely damaged and leaning at a 45-degree angle, held up only by the tension in the lines. The skid marks were clearly visible on the pavement, showing exactly how Patricia's BMW had hydroplaned, spun out of control, and struck the pole. There was absolutely nothing in the trajectory that suggested she had been swerving to avoid an obstacle. She had simply been driving too fast for conditions. I took photos of everything: the skid marks, the pole, the glass and debris field, the sight lines showing that my driveway was at least 50 yards from the impact point. If this went to court, I wanted documentation. Tom came out of his house as I was taking photos. "Heard the latest," he called. "What now?" "Patricia's telling everyone who will listen that you caused her accident. She's got Carolyn calling neighbors to collect statements about what a problem you've been with HOA compliance. They're trying to build a case that you were harassing her." I laughed without humor. "I was harassing her. Tom, you were there yesterday. She came to my house to harass me about how I parked my truck in my own driveway." "I know, man. I already told Carolyn that if anyone was doing the harassing, it was Patricia. Mrs. Chen told her the same thing." "Nobody's buying Patricia's version except the people who are already on her side." He paused. "But you should know that the HOA board sent out an email this morning. They're fining you $500 for reckless endangerment of community members." "They're what?" He showed me his phone. Sure enough, there was an email from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA board, sent to all residents, announcing that I was being fined for deliberately creating a hazardous condition by blocking a community street during a severe weather event, resulting in injury to a board member. The email was signed by Patricia Morrison, President, and countersigned by Carolyn Wheeler, Secretary. It included language about the HOA's commitment to safety and how they would not tolerate residents who endangered others through negligent or malicious behavior. "This is libel," I said, reading through the email again. "Everything in here is a lie. My truck wasn't blocking anything. I didn't create any hazard. And Patricia crashed because she was driving recklessly during a storm." "You need a lawyer," Tom said seriously. "Patricia doesn't back down, and she's got the HOA resources behind her. They've got a legal fund specifically for enforcement actions." He was right. I went back inside and started making calls. My girlfriend Rebecca recommended her cousin, Aaron Chambers, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and personal injury defense. I called his office and was surprised to get through to him directly. "Mr. Carmichael," Aaron said after I explained the situation, "let me make sure I understand this correctly. The HOA president came to your house to cite you for how you parked in your own driveway. Hours later, she crashed her car during a severe storm. Now she's claiming you caused the accident by blocking the street, which you did not do, and the HOA is fining you for reckless endangerment. That's exactly what happened. And you have witnesses to the initial encounter. witnesses to you being home during the storm, and physical evidence that your vehicle was never in the street, multiple witnesses, and extensive photo documentation. Aaron was quiet for a moment. This is one of the more absurd cases I've come across, and I deal with HOA disputes regularly. Here's what's going to happen. Patricia Morrison is going to file either a civil lawsuit or an insurance claim, or both, trying to hold you liable for her accident. The HOA will attempt to fine you and possibly place a lien on your property if you don't pay. But based on what you're telling me, her case has no merit whatsoever. So what do I do? First, don't pay any fines. Don't acknowledge any wrongdoing. Don't communicate with Patricia or the HOA board except through me. Second, send me all your documentation, photos, witness statements, the police report when it becomes available, everything. Third, file a complaint with the city about the HOA's actions. What they're doing is harassment, and depending on what's in their actual governing documents, they may not even have the authority to fine you for this. Can I sue them for libel? That email they sent to the entire neighborhood is full of lies. Possibly. Let's focus first on defending against whatever Patricia throws at you, then we can discuss counterclaims. But yes, if they've damaged your reputation with false statements, you may have grounds for a defamation suit. I felt better having legal representation, but the situation was still infuriating. I had done nothing wrong, yet I was being dragged into what would likely be months of legal drama because Patricia couldn't admit she had made a terrible decision. Over the next few days, the neighborhood battle lines formed. Most of the residents who had been on the receiving end of Patricia's HOA zealotry supported me, sharing their own stories of ridiculous fines and harassment. Tom had faced over $2,000 in fines for his mailbox color. The Rodriguez family had been cited for parking their own RV in their own driveway for more than 48 hours. Mrs. Chen had been fined for having the wrong type of flowers in her front garden, but Patricia's loyal supporters rallied around her as well. Carolyn, the HOA secretary, sent multiple emails defending Patricia's record and painting me as a troublemaker who had consistently flouted community standards. Another board member, Sandra Mitchell, posted on the neighborhood Facebook group about how I was making the community unsafe through my disrespect for rules. The Facebook group became a war zone. Neighbors who had been friendly were now arguing in comment threads about HOA authority, community standards, and personal responsibility. Someone created a poll asking whether residents supported the board's actions against me. It was running 60-40 in my favor, but the fact that 40% thought I was somehow at fault was disheartening. A week after the accident, I received a certified letter from Patricia's attorney, a firm called Morrison and Associates. The letter informed me that Patricia was filing a civil lawsuit seeking damages for medical expenses, vehicle replacement, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. The total amount claimed was $250,000. I forwarded the letter to Aaron immediately. He called me within an hour. "This is going to trial," he said bluntly. "Patricia isn't interested in being reasonable. Her attorney is her brother-in-law, by the way, which explains why he took such a ridiculous case. But this actually works in our favor." How does any of this work in our favor? Because once we're in court, everything becomes a matter of public record. The police report, the weather data, the witness statements, the physical evidence, all of it. Patricia is betting that you'll settle to avoid the hassle of litigation. But if we go to trial and she loses, which she will, it establishes legally that her claims are false. That strengthens any counterclaim we file for defamation and harassment. So we're going to trial. Unless she drops the suit, yes. but given her personality as you've described it, I don't think she's going to drop it. She's going to push this all the way, believing she's in the right." Aaron was correct. Over the following weeks, the legal process ground forward. Discovery was initiated, with both sides requesting documents and evidence. Aaron subpoenaed the police report, which clearly stated that the accident was the result of excessive speed for conditions, and that no obstacles were present in the roadway. He obtained the Weather Service data showing the severity of the storm at the time of the accident. He collected written statements from Tom, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, and several other neighbors confirming that my truck had been in my driveway. Patricia's attorney, meanwhile, filed requests for my cell phone records, trying to prove I had left my house. He requested footage from any security cameras I might have, which I didn't own. He even sent someone to measure the width of the street and the angle of my driveway, though what they hoped to prove with that information was unclear. The HOA board continued their own campaign. I received a second fine notice, this time for $300 for continued non-compliance with parking ordinances. Aaron sent them a cease and desist letter, informing them that any further harassment would result in a separate legal action against the HOA and its board members personally. That got their attention. The board held an emergency meeting, which, according to the minutes published to residents, included a heated discussion about whether they could be held personally liable for their actions as board members. 3 of the 5 board members voted to suspend all fines against me pending the resolution of Patricia's lawsuit. Patricia and Carolyn were outvoted. Meanwhile, Patricia's medical situation was becoming public knowledge. According to the Neighborhood Gossip Network, her broken ribs had led to complications, requiring additional hospitalization. Her fractured wrist required surgery to insert pins. She was out of work for 6 weeks, and her insurance company was balking at covering some of her claims because they suspected reckless driving. I almost felt sorry for her, until I remembered that she was suing me for $250,000 for an accident I had nothing to do with. 3 months after the accident, we received the court date, October 15th, in Marion County Superior Court. Judge Robert Hendricks would be presiding. Aaron did some research on the judge and reported that Hendricks had a reputation for being no-nonsense and impatient with frivolous cases. "That's good for us," Aaron explained. "If we can establish early that Patricia's case lacks merit, Hendricks may dismiss it before we even have to mount a full defense." "What are the chances of that, with the evidence we have?" "Pretty good. But we prepare as if we're going the full distance, just in case." As the court date approached, the neighborhood tension increased. Someone started a petition to recall the HOA board, which garnered over 100 signatures from the 300 homes in the development. Patricia responded by sending out an email calling the petition illegal and threatening to fine anyone who continued to circulate it. That backfired spectacularly. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, a reporter from Channel 13 was in our neighborhood doing interviews. Tom gave a fantastic soundbite about HOA overreach and abuse of power. Mrs. Chen talked about being fined for her garden. Mr. Rodriguez showed the reporter his citation for parking his RV in his own driveway. And I explained how the HOA president had crashed her car during a storm and was now suing me, claiming I was responsible despite all evidence to the contrary. The segment aired on the evening news 2 weeks before the trial. It was devastating for Patricia. The reporter had done their homework, obtaining copies of the police report through a public records request. They showed the crash scene, interviewed a weather expert who explained how dangerous the conditions were that night, and spoke with neighbors who confirmed my truck had been in my driveway. The segment ended with the reporter asking Patricia directly if she regretted driving during the storm. Patricia, standing in her doorway looking tired and still wearing a wrist brace, said, "The only thing I regret is not being able to enforce community standards with residents who think they are above the rules. Mr. Carmichael created the hazardous condition that led to my accident, and I look forward to proving that in court. It was exactly the wrong thing to say." The comment section on the news station's website exploded with hundreds of people calling Patricia entitled, delusional, and a perfect example of HOA abuse. Several comments specifically mentioned attending the trial to watch her case get thrown out. Aaron called me after the segment aired. "I couldn't have asked for better publicity. Patricia just went on record, on camera, maintaining her false claims after being presented with contradictory evidence. If this goes to trial, we can use that footage to show her lack of credibility." October 15th arrived cold and rainy, a fitting echo of the storm that had started everything. I put on my best suit, met Aaron at the courthouse downtown, and prepared for whatever the day would bring. The Marion County Superior Courthouse was an imposing building, all concrete and glass, designed to make everyone who entered feel small and insignificant. We went through security, rode the elevator to the 6th floor, and found the courtroom assigned to our case. Patricia was already there with her attorney, Thomas Morrison, her brother-in-law. She looked different than I remembered, thinner with her arms still in a brace, her face drawn. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Then I remembered the $250,000 lawsuit and the months of harassment, and the sympathy evaporated. The courtroom slowly filled with people. I was surprised to see Tom, Mrs. Chen, and several other neighbors file in to watch the proceedings. Derek, Patricia's husband, sat on the opposite side, looking miserable. Carolyn was there too, glaring at me with undisguised hostility. At precisely 9 a.m. the bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Hendricks." Judge Hendricks was a stern-looking man in his early 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He took his seat, surveyed the courtroom, and immediately focused on the plaintiff's table. "This is Morrison versus Carmichael, case number 49-2649, he said, reading from a file. "Miss Morrison is suing Mr. Carmichael for damages related to a motor vehicle accident that occurred on July 8th of this year. Is that correct?" Thomas Morrison stood. "Yes, Your Honor. We're prepared to prove that the defendant's negligent and reckless behavior directly caused my client's accident, resulting in significant injuries and financial losses." "Mr. Chambers," Judge Hendricks looked at Aaron, "Your Honor, we're prepared to demonstrate that Miss Morrison's claims are entirely without merit and that this case should never have been filed. We'll be moving for immediate dismissal based on the complete lack of evidence supporting the plaintiff's allegations." Judge Hendricks nodded slowly. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Mr. Morrison, your client alleges that Mr. Carmichael blocked a public street with his vehicle, causing her to swerve and crash. Is that the essence of your claim?" "Yes, Your Honor, along with allegations of harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress through a pattern of HOA violations." The judge's expression didn't change, but I saw his eyes narrow slightly. "We'll address the primary claim first. Present your evidence that Mr. Carmichael's vehicle was blocking the street." Thomas Morrison stood and approached with a folder. "Your Honor, we have testimony from Miss Morrison stating that she was forced to swerve to avoid the defendant's truck, which was parked at an angle protruding into the roadway. We also have documentation of Mr. Carmichael's history of parking violations within the community. Do you have any photographs showing the defendant's vehicle in the street at the time of the accident? No, Your Honor, but you have any witness testimony from anyone other than Miss Morrison stating they saw the vehicle in the street? The accident occurred during a severe storm, Your Honor. There were no other witnesses on the street at that time. Do you have any physical evidence, measurements, tire tracks, damage to the defendant's vehicle consistent with it being struck or involved in the accident? Thomas Morrison was starting to look uncomfortable. Your Honor, the severity of the weather conditions that evening prevented immediate documentation of the scene. By the time investigators could properly assess the situation, conditions had changed. Judge Hendricks leaned back in his chair. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your client was driving during a severe thunderstorm warning. According to the police report, which I have here, the investigating officer found no evidence of any obstacle in the roadway. The skid marks and impact pattern are consistent with a vehicle hydroplaning due to excessive speed for conditions. Multiple witnesses have stated that the defendant was home at the time of the accident and that his vehicle was parked in his driveway, on his property. What evidence do you have that contradicts any of this? Your Honor, my client's testimony. Your client was involved in a serious accident and suffered a head injury. Her testimony about the specific moments leading to the crash is necessarily going to be unreliable. Unless you have objective evidence supporting her claim that Mr. Carmichael's vehicle was in the street, I'm not seeing a viable case here. I watched Patricia lean over and whisper urgently to her attorney. Thomas Morrison nodded and turned back to the judge. Your Honor, if we could call Miss Morrison to the stand to explain. No. Judge Hendricks cut him off. I don't need to hear testimony when there's no foundational evidence to support your claim. Mr. Chambers, present your evidence. Aaron stood smoothly. Your Honor, we have extensive documentation proving that Mr. Carmichael's vehicle was never in the street. First, the police report states clearly that no obstacles were present in the roadway. He handed copies to the judge and to Thomas Morrison. Second, we have photographs taken by Mr. Carmichael the morning after the accident showing his truck in his driveway, with no indication it had moved during the storm. More copies distributed. Third, we have written statements from 4 neighbors who can testify that Mr. Carmichael was home during the storm and that his vehicle remained in his driveway. He handed over a thick stack of papers. Judge Hendricks reviewed the documents, taking his time. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of paper. Your Honor, Aaron continued, we also have weather service data showing that at the time of Miss Morrison's accident, the area was experiencing severe thunderstorms with wind gusts exceeding 65 miles per hour, heavy rain, and hail. The National Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm warning advising all residents to seek shelter immediately and to avoid travel. Miss Morrison chose to drive during these conditions. Why was Miss Morrison out driving in such dangerous weather? Judge Hendricks asked, looking at Thomas Morrison. She was attending to HOA business, Your Honor. As president of the Homeowners Association, she had responsibilities. During a severe storm warning, the judge's skepticism was evident. That seems profoundly unwise. Patricia stood up abruptly. Your Honor, if I may, Miss Morrison, please sit down. You'll speak when called upon. Patricia sat, but I could see the anger radiating from her. Judge Hendricks returned his attention to the documents before him. Mr. Morrison, I'm looking at the police report's conclusion. It states, and I quote, "Accident appears to be the result of excessive speed for weather conditions resulting in loss of vehicle control and subsequent impact with fixed object. No evidence of contributory factors from other parties. That seems pretty definitive. Your Honor, we believe the investigation was inadequate. On what basis? The responding officers documented the scene, measured the skid marks, photographed the damage, and interviewed witnesses. What part of their investigation do you find inadequate? Thomas Morrison looked at his notes, clearly searching for an answer. Your Honor, we believe that the defendant's history of conflicts with the HOA board, specifically with Miss Morrison, suggests a motive for creating a hazardous situation. Judge Hendricks removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture of someone losing patience. Mr. Morrison, are you seriously suggesting that your client's lawsuit is based on speculation about motive rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing? Your Honor, the pattern of behavior. I don't care about HOA disputes. This is a civil case alleging that Mr. Carmichael negligently or intentionally caused a motor vehicle accident. You've presented no credible evidence that his vehicle was in the street, no evidence that he created any hazard, and no evidence that he had anything to do with your client's accident whatsoever. In fact, all the evidence suggests that Miss Morrison was driving recklessly during dangerous weather and lost control of her vehicle as a result of her own poor judgment. The courtroom was dead silent. Patricia's face had gone from angry to pale. I could see Derek with his head in his hands. Furthermore, Judge Hendricks continued, his voice taking on an edge, I'm troubled by what appears to be a misuse of the legal system to continue a personal dispute. Miss Morrison, please stand. Patricia stood slowly, leaning on the table for support. Miss Morrison, did you review the evidence before filing this lawsuit? Yes, Your Honor, I know what happened. That man, she pointed at me, has been a problem for the HOA since he moved in. He refuses to follow the rules, he's disrespectful to the board, and that's not what I asked. I asked if you reviewed the objective evidence, the police report, the weather data, the witness statements. Did you review those documents before claiming that Mr. Carmichael caused your accident? Patricia hesitated. I know what I saw. His truck was Miss Morrison. You suffered a head injury in this accident. You were concussed. Your memory of the specific moments leading to the crash is likely impaired. Did any of the medical professionals treating you explain that to you? Yes, but I remember. What you remember is that you were driving in a severe storm, you lost control of your vehicle, and you crashed. What you've done is retroactively assign blame to someone you were already in conflict with, without any evidence to support that assignment of blame. Is that accurate? Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Let me be very clear, Judge Hendricks said, his voice firm. This lawsuit is without merit. There is no evidence supporting your claims. You've subjected Mr. Carmichael to months of legal stress and expense over an accident that was entirely your own fault. This is precisely the sort of frivolous litigation that wastes this court's time and resources. He turned to Thomas Morrison. Counselor, you should have advised your client that she had no case. The fact that you proceeded with this lawsuit despite the complete lack of supporting evidence suggests either incompetence or a willingness to abuse the legal process. Which is it? Thomas Morrison's face had turned red. Your Honor, I believed my client's account of the events. Belief is not evidence. Your duty as an attorney is to evaluate the evidence objectively, not to simply take your client's word, especially when all objective evidence contradicts their claim. He shuffled the papers before him. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Miss Morrison, you will be responsible for all court costs and Mr. Carmichael's reasonable attorney fees. Mr. Chambers, submit your fee statement within 30 days. Your Honor, Patricia's voice was shrill. "This is not Miss Morrison. This proceeding is concluded. If you continue to speak out of turn, I will hold you in contempt. Is that clear?" Patricia closed her mouth, tears of frustration and anger streaming down her face. "One more thing," Judge Hendricks said, looking at Patricia with an expression of profound disapproval. "The evidence presented suggests that you, as HOA president, sent emails to your entire neighborhood making false accusations against Mr. Carmichael. You claimed he deliberately created a hazardous condition and endangered community members. Those statements were defamatory, and they were made with knowledge that they were false or with reckless disregard for the truth. If Mr. Carmichael chooses to pursue a defamation claim against you, this court's dismissal of your case will be strong evidence in his favor." He banged his gavel. "Dismissed. Next case." The courtroom erupted in whispers. I sat in stunned silence, not quite believing it was over so quickly. Aaron was grinning beside me, making notes in his file. Patricia was being helped from the courtroom by Thomas Morrison and Carolyn, her movements stiff and jerky. She didn't look at me as she passed, but the fury in her expression was unmistakable. Outside the courtroom, Tom and Mrs. Chen congratulated me. Other neighbors who had attended shook my hand and expressed their relief at the outcome. Aaron pulled me aside for a quick conference. "That went even better than I expected," he said. "Hendricks demolished her case in under 30 minutes. Now we need to discuss next steps." The judge mentioned defamation, and he's right. You have a strong case. "I just want this to be over," I said honestly. "I don't want to spend more months in litigation." "I understand. But consider this. Patricia hasn't learned anything from today. She's going to go back to the HOA and continue her campaign against you unless there are consequences. A defamation suit, or even the threat of one, might finally make her back off." He had a point. "Let me think about it." Over the next few days, the fallout from the trial spread through the neighborhood. The news station that had covered the story before ran a follow-up segment about the dismissal, with the headline "HOA President's Lawsuit Thrown Out." The segment included an interview with Aaron discussing frivolous HOA litigation and residents' rights. The petition to recall the HOA board gained another 100 signatures. A special election was called for November, and 3 of the 5 board seats would be up for vote, including Patricia's. Patricia herself went radio silent. No more mass emails, no more fines notices, no more harassment about parking or mailboxes or flower colors. According to Derek, whom I ran into at the grocery store, she was seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of the accident and the stress of the lawsuit. He apologized to me, saying he should have pushed back harder against her decision to sue. "She's always been intense about the HOA stuff," he said, looking exhausted. "But after the accident, it became an obsession. She couldn't admit that she had made a mistake driving in that storm, so she needed someone else to blame. You were the convenient target. How is she doing?" "Physically, I mean." "Better. The ribs have healed. The wrist is still giving her trouble but improving. The medical bills have been brutal, though. The insurance company denied a bunch of her claims because the adjuster determined she was driving recklessly. And now with the court costs and your attorney fees on top of that." He shook his head. "It's been a financial disaster." I almost felt guilty, but then I remembered that none of this was my fault. Patricia had made every bad decision that led to this outcome. The HOA election in November was a landslide. Patricia, Carolyn, and Sandra all lost their seats to challengers who ran on a platform of reasonable enforcement and no more harassment. Jim and Michael, the 2 board members who had voted to suspend my fines, kept their seats. The new board's first action was to cancel all outstanding fines that had been issued during Patricia's tenure without proper basis in the HOA covenants. Tom's mailbox fines were canceled. The Rodriguez family's RV citations were canceled. Mrs. Chen's flower garden fines were canceled. And my parking fines were formally rescinded with a written apology from the board. The second action was to revise the HOA covenant enforcement procedures to require photographic evidence and multiple board member approval before any fine could be issued. They also established an appeals process for residents who felt they had been unfairly targeted. The third action was to review the HOA's legal bills and discover that Patricia had spent over $30,000 of community funds on various enforcement actions and legal consultations during her 2-year tenure as president. The new board sent out a detailed accounting to all residents, showing how association dues had been spent on Patricia's vendetta against various neighbors. That revelation triggered another wave of anger toward Patricia. Several residents called for her to be personally liable for the wasted funds, though the new board's attorney advised that recovering the money would be difficult and expensive. In December, I received a personal letter from Patricia. It was handwritten, 2 pages long and remarkably different in tone from anything she had said or written before. "Mr. Carmichael," it began, "I am writing to apologize for my behavior over the past 6 months. My therapist has helped me understand that I displaced my anger and fear about the accident onto you, because I couldn't cope with the reality that I had made a terrible decision that nearly cost me my life. Admitting that I was wrong about the accident, about the lawsuit, and about how I treated you as a resident of this community is incredibly difficult, but it's necessary for my healing and for making amends. I cannot undo the stress, expense, and harassment you endured because of my actions, but I want you to know that I recognize the harm I caused and I am deeply sorry. I am stepping down from the HOA board and will not seek re-election. I hope you can find it in yourself to forgive me, though I understand if you cannot. Sincerely, Patricia Morrison." I read the letter 3 times, trying to determine if it was genuine or another manipulation. The cynic in me suspected the latter, but there was something in the handwriting and the tone that suggested real remorse. I showed it to Rebecca, who had been my support system through the entire ordeal. She read it carefully and handed it back. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell her to go to hell, but part of me feels like accepting the apology is the healthier thing to do. You don't have to decide right now. But remember, accepting an apology doesn't mean you have to be friends with her or trust her. It just means you're choosing not to carry anger anymore." She was right, as usual. I drafted a brief response and mailed it a few days later. "Patricia, I accept your apology. What happened was difficult for everyone involved, but I appreciate you taking responsibility for your actions. I hope you're healing both physically and emotionally. I have no interest in pursuing any further legal action, and I consider this matter closed. I wish you well. Aaron Carmichael." In January, I received the check for my attorney fees from Patricia's insurance company, $8,000 that covered most of what Aaron had charged. Aaron himself sent me a final bill marked paid in full with a note that said, "Consider the balance my contribution to fighting HOA tyranny. If you ever need anything else, give me a call." Life in Meadowbrook Hills slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board focused on actual community improvements rather than harassing residents over minor infractions. They organized neighborhood events, improved the common areas, and generally made the development a more pleasant place to live. I still parked my truck in my driveway, sometimes at an angle, sometimes perfectly straight, depending on my mood. Nobody ever mentioned it again. Tom successfully got approval to keep his colonial blue mailbox, with the new board determining that the color difference was negligible and not worth fighting about. The Rodriguez family parked their RV in their driveway whenever they wanted. Mrs. Chen's garden flourished with whatever flowers she chose to plant. Patricia and Derek moved out of the neighborhood in February, downsizing to a condo across town. According to the Neighborhood Gossip Network, the combination of medical bills, legal costs, and the stress of living among neighbors who knew about the lawsuit had made staying untenable. I saw Derek one last time, helping load boxes into a moving truck. We exchanged a wave but didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Rebecca and I got engaged in March, and when we started looking for a house together, one of our key criteria was no HOA or a very relaxed HOA. We eventually found a place in Carmel, in a neighborhood where the HOA's only real rule was keeping lawns mowed occasionally and not painting your house neon colors. It was perfect. Before I moved out of Meadowbrook Hills, the new HOA board hosted a going-away barbecue in my honor, which was both touching and slightly embarrassing. Tom gave a speech about how my fight against Patricia's overreach had helped liberate the whole neighborhood from her tyranny. Mrs. Chen presented me with a beautiful arrangement of flowers from her garden. Mr. Rodriguez gifted me a 6-pack of craft beer and a handshake. "You stood up to her when most of us were too intimidated," he said. "That took guts, especially when she came after you so hard. We won't forget that." Standing in the park area of the development, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends through adversity, eating burgers and drinking beer on a warm spring evening, I realized that the whole nightmare had actually brought something positive. This community had been living under Patricia's thumb for years, accepting unreasonable rules and harassment because they didn't know they could fight back. My battle had shown them that HOAs aren't above challenge, that boards can be changed, and that standing up for yourself matters. As the sun set and the party wound down, I took one last look around Meadowbrook Hills. It was a nice development, well-maintained, with good people who had finally reclaimed their community from someone who had confused authority with power. I thought about Patricia, living in her new condo, hopefully learning that rules exist to serve communities, not to allow petty tyrants to dominate their neighbors. I hope she found peace and maybe a hobby that didn't involve measuring the angles of other people's parked vehicles. Mostly, I was grateful that the whole mess was finally over. The storm that had brought Patricia crashing into that utility pole had, in a strange way, been exactly what the neighborhood needed. It had exposed the depths of her obsession, forced a reckoning with her abuse of power, and ultimately led to real change. I drove away from Meadowbrook Hills for the last time on a Saturday morning in May, my truck loaded with the last of my belongings. In the rearview mirror, I saw Tom standing in his driveway, his colonial blue mailbox gleaming in the sun, waving goodbye. I honked twice and headed toward my new life with Rebecca, leaving behind the HOA battles and courtroom drama. The whole experience had taught me valuable lessons about standing up for yourself, the importance of documentation, and the danger of giving small amounts of power to people who will abuse it. It had also taught me that most people are reasonable and decent when they're not being intimidated by someone who mistakes their position for actual authority. 6 months after the trial, I was having dinner with Rebecca at a restaurant downtown when I saw Patricia and Derek at a table across the room. For a moment, our eyes met. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her presence without hostility. She nodded back, something like relief crossing her face, and returned her attention to her meal. We didn't approach each other, didn't speak. There was no dramatic confrontation or tearful reconciliation. Just two people who had been on opposite sides of an unnecessary conflict, now living separate lives, acknowledging each other's humanity for a brief moment before moving on. That felt right. That felt like closure. Rebecca noticed the exchange. Was that her? Yeah, she looks different. Older. Going through something like that ages you. The accident, the failed lawsuit, losing her position, having to move. That's a lot of consequences for driving too fast in a storm and then being too proud to admit it. You feel sorry for her. I considered the question carefully. I feel sorry that she felt she needed to be so controlling. I feel sorry that whatever was going on in her life made harassing neighbors over mailbox colors feel important. But I don't regret standing up to her. Some people need to face consequences before they learn. We finished our meal and left the restaurant. Outside, the evening air was warm and pleasant. Indianapolis was beautiful in the spring, full of life and possibility. Rebecca took my hand as we walked to the car. No regrets about the whole thing, she asked, only that it happened at all. But if it had to happen, I'm glad it ended the way it did. Justice served, lessons learned, community improved. That's about as good an outcome as you can hope for. As I drove home, I thought about all the people I had met during the ordeal. Aaron, my attorney, who had been exactly the right mix of competent and passionate about fighting HOA overreach. Judge Hendricks, who had seen through Patricia's nonsense immediately and delivered justice with precision. Tom, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, and all the other neighbors who had supported me and found their own courage to challenge the status quo. And even Patricia, in a way. She had been the antagonist of my story, but she was the protagonist of her own, a person who had made terrible decisions that spiraled out of control. Her apology letter, whether fully genuine or partially strategic, suggested she had at least gained some self-awareness from the experience. That was something. The whole situation could have gone very differently. If I hadn't taken photos, if the neighbors hadn't been willing to provide statements, if I had given in and paid the initial fines to avoid conflict, Patricia's version of events might have prevailed. I might have ended up with a judgment against me, financial ruin, maybe even a lien on my house. But I had fought back and I had won, and the neighborhood was better for it. That was worth something. Years later, after Rebecca and I were married and settled into our HOA-light life in Carmel, I would occasionally tell the story at parties or gatherings. It always got a reaction, usually from other people who had their own HOA horror stories. The details might vary, the specific complaints might be different, but the theme was always the same. Someone in a position of minor authority letting that power corrupt them into thinking they could control their neighbors' lives in unreasonable ways. The story of Patricia Morrison and her crashed BMW became, in my memory, a cautionary tale about what happens when HOAs forget their purpose. They exist to maintain property values and handle communal resources, not to micromanage how people live in their own homes. When that line gets crossed, conflict becomes inevitable. And sometimes, that conflict ends with someone crashing into a utility pole during a storm, filing a frivolous lawsuit, and having a judge throw out their case immediately while scolding them for abusing the legal system. It wasn't the ending Patricia had envisioned, but it was the ending she had earned. On the 10-year anniversary of the accident, I drove past Meadowbrook Hills out of curiosity. The development looked good, well-maintained but not obsessively so. I saw mailboxes of various shades of blue, cars parked at different angles in driveways, and even an RV prominently displayed in one driveway. The neighborhood had clearly maintained its freedom from petty tyranny. I didn't stop or drive through the streets. That chapter of my life was closed, and there was no need to reopen it. But I was glad to see that the community I had fought for, even inadvertently, was thriving in its more relaxed state. As I drove back to my own home, where Rebecca was waiting with our 2-year-old daughter Anna, I reflected on how a single storm, one terrible decision, and one person's refusal to be bullied had changed so many lives. Not dramatically, not earth-shatteringly, but meaningfully. A neighborhood liberated, a tyrant deposed, justice served, lessons learned, and somewhere out there I hoped Patricia Morrison was living a quieter life, having finally learned that power without wisdom is just noise, and authority without justice is just bullying with a title. The storm had come and gone, leaving destruction in its wake. But from that destruction had come something better. A community that stood up for itself, a legal system that worked, and a reminder that ordinary people facing ordinary problems can still fight back and win. That was the real story. Not the crash, not the lawsuit, not even the dramatic courtroom dismissal. The real story was about standing your ground when you're right, documenting everything, getting good legal help, and trusting that when the evidence is on your side, justice will usually prevail. Usually. Not always. But often enough to make the fight worthwhile. And on those occasions when someone asks me what I learned from the whole experience, I always give the same answer. Take photos, keep records, know your rights, and never let someone with a clipboard and a title convince you that their power is absolute. Because it's not. And the moment they try to use it against you unjustly is the moment you have the right and the responsibility to fight back. That was the lesson of the storm, the crash, the lawsuit, and Judge Hendrick's immediate dismissal. That was the lesson I carried forward into my life, and that was the lesson I would someday teach my daughter Anna when she was old enough to understand. Power is not authority. A title is not wisdom. And sometimes, the right thing to do is simply refuse to back down when you know you're right, no matter how intimidating your opponent seems. The storm passed. The Karen crashed. The judge threw out her case, and life went on, better and more free than it had been before. That was enough. That was everything.